What is up, everybody? It is the last day before the NBA All-Star break, and we are back at it with another NBA breakdown. Just 5 games on the slate today, and it's just me, so this is probably going to go pretty quick. Definitely have loved having the guests. I think it's great to have a couple different perspectives, so going to continue to work on doing that after the All-Star break. Yesterday kind of sucked, man. I had a couple team totals that barely missed Oklahoma City by half a point, and then Utah didn't show up. So those couple things made it a losing day instead of a winning one. But, it always could go a lot worse too. So we'll live with it, move on to the next. This day before the All-Star break, I'm not sure. It's the spot to have the most confidence. It's hard to know how much teams are going to show up and how much they're already on vacation in their mind. But all we can do is look at the matchups and the numbers and see if it seems like there are some good spots. Certainly, these games still matter for teams, especially the ones that are playing for anything in the long run. So at least matters a little bit. So we'll dive in and see what we can find and hopefully get a little bit green going into the break. Thursday, February 17th. This is the NBA breakdown. First up is Heat at the Hornets. Miami -4.5, total of 224.5. Miami and Charlotte both come in on 1 day of rest here. As far as injuries, Jimmy Butler's a game time decision, and I definitely do think that that's worth watching, especially because Tyler Hero is out. And so if Butler's out, that takes away two significant offensive contributors. When you look at the statistics, the difference actually isn't especially huge with Hero or Butler out in terms of Miami offensively or defensively. But I think the combination of the two and just the way that it whittles down the offensive options could matter. So worth watching whether Butler plays or not. Charlotte also coming in on 1 day of rest. They don't have any massive injury concerns here. I mean, Hayward is still out, but he's been out. Martin's out. He's been out as well. So nothing other than those two. These teams did play recently, February 5th, and Miami won 104-86 in Charlotte. So in an incredibly low-scoring game, especially when you look at the total here, 224.5. I mean, we're 30 or 40 points higher in the total than the total was in the last game between these two. But obviously, the games don't always look the same when you run them back. A few things, a number of different angles to look at here today in this game. It's actually probably one of the ones that I like most on this slate out of the 5 that we've got in front of us. Miami has been scoring pretty well against bad defenses, and right now I would consider Charlotte to be a pretty bad defense, even though they've had some games where they've come through all right. In their last 9 games here, Miami does have 2 times where they only scored 104, but every other time they've been 110 plus. They've been at 120 plus. 2 times in those last 8, 115 plus 4 times in the last 8. So really scoring pretty well against bad defenses. When Miami's played decent offenses, which actually I'm not sure if I'd put Charlotte in the category of a decent offense right now. They're certainly a team with great offensive potential, but that hasn't come through lately. But for the sake of this breakdown, we'll consider them a decent offense. Miami's still been fairly stingy against those teams. They did allow 122 and 118, 2 games in their last 8. But other than that, they've got 3 games under 100, 1 game right at 100, a 110, a 114. So what I would say is half the time they're holding teams to less than 100 points, and that's out of teams that have decent offenses. And by decent, I mean, top 10-ish in the NBA. Miami has won 3 straight against Charlotte, and in those games they allowed 86, 99, and 111. So it's a small sample size, but held them down pretty well. One angle you could look at here is the first half. Charlotte scored under 50 in 5 of the last 9 and allowed over 50 in 8 of the last 9, and so they are not winning the first half on a regular basis. On the other side, Miami scored over 50 in 8 of the last 10, so that looks good, but they have allowed 50 to 55 in 6 of the last 10. So I wouldn't say it's the strongest angle, but when you look at this game that only has a 4.5 point spread, that means that the first half spread is probably 2.5. And I think that's not a bad spot given the recent performance of these teams and how they've been trending. Here's the big thing for me in this game. This is probably the most significant stat line that I'm looking at, and that's how Charlotte's been playing at home. This goes back 9 home games, 15 games total. Their offensive rating at home in those last 9 games, 102.9. On the road, it's 118.1. Defensive rating is pretty similar, 110.8 at home, 112.7 on the road. So we'll call that about even. Plus minus, minus 7.9 at home, plus 5.4 on the road. So we're talking about a 13 plus point swing in that plus minus between home and road. 103.8 points per game scored at home, 125 on the road. Field goal percentage, 41.3 versus 49.2. 3-point percentage, 27.6 versus 38.3. I mean, this is crazy to me that they're shooting under 30% from 3-point range over their last 9 games at home. Now, some of those offensive numbers away from home are skewed up a little bit because they scored 158 versus Indiana in one of those games, but let's toss the away numbers out the window. We're still talking about a 102.9 offensive rating at home, a minus 7.9 plus minus, 41.3% from the field, and 27.6 from 3-point range. I mean, that's just really bad, especially for a team that has the offensive potential that Charlotte has. I would expect at some point there's going to be some regression back up. They're not going to continue to be that bad on the season, but heading into a break, I don't know that that's the best spot for me to think that they're going to turn it around. It's more like go away, regroup, come back, and maybe something changes. Miami's numbers, home and on the road, pretty similar here. And Miami's been good defensively. They allow 33.2% from 3-point range on the road. I mean, that's not the kind of team that you just go get off against. And I know that Miami does allow good 3-point shooting to shooting guards. I've seen a number of people post on Twitter today already about Terry Rozier in this game. And yeah, maybe that's a good spot. But I'm just saying overall as a team, I'm not sure it's still a great spot. Here's the other thing matchup-wise. Charlotte's 4th in the league in points in the paint. That's where they really get it done. Miami is number 1 in the league defending points in the paint. So it's not a team you're going to get right against in the area where you need to be able to score. I think Charlotte's going to have to score really well from 3-point range in order to have success in this game. I don't think they're, based on the matchup stat I just shared, Adebayo being in the middle, Charlotte not having great big men, getting Montrezl Harrell did help them. I think that's a good pickup. But again, I just don't see them being able to really get right in the paint in this game. In terms of trends here as well, the Heat are 6-2 against the spread in the last 18. The last 8 in Charlotte. The over's 5-2 in those last 7 meetings. So here's where I ended up on this game. My line on it is Miami 115, Charlotte 105. So that gives me a pretty wide margin in terms of what I think the value is on the spread here. And that's the play that I like is Miami minus 4.5 as this begins to push up. I think it's already at minus 5 in some places. Obviously, if I have a 10-point spread here, I still like it at 5. But if it keeps pushing up, you like it less and less. In terms of the total, I would lean toward the under here. I think we always get inflated totals on Charlotte because they have so much offensive potential. It's not something that I've played, and I may actually end up not playing it just because I have lower confidence in it. But, again, I just said my total here, I have at 220. So 4.5 points of value, that's something. And it's at least something that I'll consider, though I'm not sure. I would also consider Charlotte's team total under here. I just don't think it's a good spot for them. Now, Miami could just absolutely not show up. That is always a possibility, especially the day before the All-Star break. But if they do, I think they continue to hold Charlotte down, and maybe we see Charlotte come back and turn it around after the break. Next game up, the Wizards and the Nets, 2 teams that are on back-to-backs, 2 teams that have kind of sucked. And eventually, Brooklyn probably won't once they get everyone back. We will see how that goes. Who knows with Simmons, all that stuff. That's not what we're here to talk about today. Washington is 3-1 against the spread on back-to-backs, so decent. They are 6-1 to the over on back-to-backs, which is 3rd best in the league. Brooklyn is 1-7-1 on back-to-backs. That's last in the league, so not a good spot in terms of that trend for them. 3-6 to the over on back-to-backs. Now, we do have to take into account that this Brooklyn team is a very different team right now than they've been the rest of the season. They finally got Curry and Drummond in, and we saw already last night how it made a difference for them to have Andre Drummond, especially defensively. He's a great rebounder. He's an interior presence, and I do think it makes a difference, but I do want to acknowledge that back-to-backs haven't been a good spot for Brooklyn on the season so far. Washington does have Gafford and Hachimura as game-time decisions. I think that matters some. Both of those are big guys who could do some work against Andre Drummond. especially Hachimura, who I know he's a power forward, but he's been playing outside more, working on his three-point shooting. I think if he plays, that gives Washington a bump, and they really need it offensively because they haven't been scoring well. These two teams did play on February 10th, so very recently. Washington won 113 to 112, but that was without Drummond, and I believe it was without Curry. I'd have to double check if that was Curry's first game in or not. So it was a really close game, and again, Brooklyn didn't have those pieces. The most points Washington has scored, I said that they've struggled offensively. Most points they've scored in their last 9 games is 113. They've been under 100 in 3 out of 9. There's been a mix of good and bad defenses in there they've done this against, but they played Indiana, who's giving up a jillion points to everyone. They played Detroit, who's doing the same. Sacramento, who's doing the same. Brooklyn, until recently, was doing the same. They did go up against Miami, Phoenix, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Memphis. Those are all good teams. So, again, it's a mixture, like 4 kind of bad teams, 5 good teams. But to have the max you score be 113 in that stretch is not very impressive to me. Brooklyn, on the other side, in the last 4 games, which is what I'm looking at because of the trades that have happened, they've been consistent. They've scored 109, 111, 111, 112. Very consistent in their scoring. In the 2 games with Drummond, Brooklyn only allowed 106 and 85. So again, this is a super small sample, and we have to be careful with putting too much weight on these things. I understand that. But just saying, Brooklyn's biggest problem, they weren't good in any respect for the last couple of weeks, but their biggest problem was that their defense was horrendous. And again, I do think Drummond makes a difference there, and I think those numbers point to that being the case. Matchup specific here, Washington is number 3 in points in the paint. Brooklyn is 18th defending points in the paint, but number 3 over their last 3 games. And again, I think Drummond makes a big difference. So if Washington needs to get it done in the paint and they have a harder time doing that in this game because of Drummond, it makes it less of a good spot for them. In the last 2 games with Drummond, Brooklyn had 51 and 49 rebounds. Their season average is 44.9. So they were 4 and 6 rebounds better, which again, to me, makes a difference. So I line this game at Brooklyn 111, Washington 104. I think that I would have to double check if this line has moved up. Let me actually check that real quick here if I can. Just refreshing this. It's Brooklyn minus 4.5. So it's moved up a half a point. That is probably, I haven't bet it yet. I definitely will consider it. It's so hard to trust Brooklyn, but I definitely don't trust the Wizards. And then in terms of the total, 216, and I have the total as 215. So definitely no value there for me. The only thing I look at there is that Washington is 6-1 to the over on back-to-backs. So that definitely would keep me off the under, and where I've lined it, no real value on the total for me. Next game up, we have the Mavs at the Pelicans. Dallas minus 3. I think they're 2.5 some places, and then a total of 215. Looks like the total's anywhere from 214 to 215.5. Interesting here, Dallas on 1 day of rest. This is getting to be a really big sample size because there's so many games now, but they are 22, 13, and 1 against the spread on 1 day of rest, 12 and 24 to the over, which is last in the league. And we know that Dallas plays good defense, so the reason their totals are going to go under is they're holding teams under 100 points a lot of the time. The Pelicans on the other side, not too much to take away from them on 1 day of rest. They're 19 and 15 against the spread, 14 and 20 to the over. So they also tend toward the under on 1 day of rest. So that's something we might want to pay attention to. There is one note in terms of injuries here that I think is worth paying attention to. Hardaway is already out, which we've known, but Bullock and Burke are both game time decisions. And I think Dallas is limited offensively. Luka's been absolutely going off since they traded Porzingis. Porzingis hadn't been playing anyway, but since that trade, he's been absolutely going off. They did get Dinwiddie back, so that could help them in terms of some reinforcements if Bullock can't play. But Bullock and Burke can both create some offensively, and Bullock especially shooting from the three-point line. And so I think if he's out, that is another tick against the total going over, because I don't see Dallas being able to score quite as much if Bullock isn't playing. Dallas has been playing phenomenal defense lately, under 100 points in 6 out of their last 7. And some of those were even against good offenses. Miami, Atlanta, Philadelphia, which Philadelphia, give or take, but all of those under 100 points. On the other side, there's 4 games now with McCollum playing for the Pelicans. They got off to a rough start, only scoring 97 against Miami. But since then, 114, 120, 109. The 120 was against Toronto, who just held Minnesota to 91 last night. First time in 20 games under 100 points. And then 109 against Memphis, which is not bad. They've played decent defense. In terms of points allowed, though, these are some things that are pushing back against the under for me. They've allowed 112, 124, 90, and 121. So 3 out of the 4, they've allowed over 110. The other thing pushing it back against the under for me is that Dallas has only had 4 games on the road in their last 15, but their defensive rating in those 4 was 117.8, which is atrocious by Dallas standards. And granted, that goes back quite a few games now, and their defense has really had a resurgence here in the last 8 games or so. So maybe we don't put too much stock in that, but I think it's at least worth mentioning. Dallas's defensive rating is 106.7 in their last 15 on 1 day of rest. So that's pretty solid. Here's the other thing, though, for the Pelicans. Like, they can score. And a lot of it comes down to how they shoot and how McCollum does in particular. In their last game, they only shot 15.4% from 3-point range. That was against Memphis, and they still only lost by 12. I mean, I know it's hypothetical and games go differently depending on how teams are shooting, but if they shoot 30%, which, I mean, I think they only shoot like 32% on the year, so that they're not a great 3-point shooting team, but 30% gives them 12 more points based on the number of threes they took. It's basically a tie with Memphis, which is a great game. I just think New Orleans is a solid team that we can't sleep on. A couple other numbers here. Dallas is 29th with scoring in points in the paint, so they don't get much done there. The Pelicans 29th with points from 3-point range. Dallas number 1 in the league defending the 3, so I don't think we're going to be able to rely on 3-pointers for the Pelicans tonight. The over is 10-4 in the last 14 meetings in New Orleans. The Mavericks are 4-1 against the spread in the last 5 in New Orleans. So this game was actually a really tough one for me to cap. I just feel like there's things moving both ways. And so it comes down to which statistics or trends do you want to put more weight on and which do you want to put less on. For that reason, this is probably a game that I'm staying away from. If I had to make a play here, I think it would be to lean toward the over, toward the under, just because of those strong trends on 1 day of rest and because I think my Dallas is playing really good defense right now. But I don't think there's actually enough value there. For me, I don't see the edge that makes me want to actually play this. So this is a game that I actually think could be a pretty good game between 2 teams that are pretty decent right now. And I really don't like the Mavericks, so maybe I'll tune in and cheer for the Pelicans. Next up, we have the 76ers at the Bucks. The Bucks up to -6.5 here, and the total is 223.5. So both teams here coming in on 1 day of rest as well. Harden's still not going to be playing here. For the Bucks, I think it does matter here. Matthews and Allen are game time decisions. Connaughton is still out. I just think the Bucks need some perimeter shooting. And I think if they don't have any of those guys, it really whittles down what they have in terms of perimeter shooting. And so it definitely makes me like Milwaukee a little bit less if none of those, well, and it's really just Allen or Matthews who might play if neither of them play. Philadelphia has struggled offensively, but they've also played good recently, but they've also played good defenses. So they scored 87 against Boston. I mean, other than the stupid game against Detroit yesterday, Boston's been holding people down. 103 against Cleveland, 100 against Oklahoma City, 98 against Dallas. Philadelphia, it just feels like not a great offensive team, but especially when they play good defenses. And I don't know that Milwaukee is a great defense. We'll get to that here in a minute. But Philadelphia's only had 2 of their last 10 games over 110 and only 3 of their last 10 over 105. So they are struggling offensively. Milwaukee is not. And I think that's something to note. Their defense, though, has been solid other than giving up 135 to Boston their last time out. Milwaukee defensively, they've allowed 115 or more in 6 out of the last 10. 3 of the other 4 were 108 or better. They did have a 98 in there, so they are not locking teams down defensively. But again, Philadelphia isn't scoring very well either. In terms of specific matchup here, Milwaukee's number 8 in fast break points per game and number 2 in their last 3. So that's a big area where Milwaukee needs to score. Philadelphia is number 6 in their last 3. But Milwaukee's number 5 in their defense against the fast break, and Philadelphia is only number 28. So I think Milwaukee has a pretty sizable advantage here in terms of fast break points. Then also in terms of the 3-pointers, Milwaukee number 4 in the percentage of points scored from 3-point range, but only number 22 in their last 3. And I think that goes to this fact of who's playing for them, where if they don't have the right people in the lineup, they struggle from 3-point range because they don't have the shooters to make it happen. And Philadelphia actually is number 6 in the league defending the 3. Milwaukee, on the other hand, is dead last defending the 3. So I think this is a spot where I would look for Milwaukee's going to have to try to get out and run when they can do that, drive to the paint. Giannis doing that some again. Embiid is not a phenomenal defender. He can be when he wants to try, but I don't think he always wants to try on the defensive end. And then for Philadelphia, they're going to need to knock down some threes, which they can do, but they don't always do. But I think those are the edges to look at in this game. Let's see. Other than that, Philadelphia has been better away in their last 14, but only had 3 of those last 14 games away. So again, a small sample size to take too much away from it. Philadelphia has lost 6 straight to Milwaukee. That is something to pay attention to because specific matchups matter. And while these two rosters have changed some over the last few years, the core has stayed pretty much the same. And so I'd put a little bit more stock in a long-term trend like that. The closest game between these two teams out of those last 6 was 4 points. And we are at 6.5 here, so we're past that 4. But Milwaukee has tended to kind of own Philadelphia. So when I look at this game, the hardest thing for me is knowing about the wing shooting for Milwaukee. If some of those, if Allen and or Matthews are ruled in, I'd like Milwaukee a little bit more. I line this game at Milwaukee 116, 110. So that doesn't give me a huge amount of value on the spread or on the total because I'm pretty close to both. So sorry, not big edges there, but hopefully some of the information might line up with things you're already thinking and give you a little bit more confidence to make a play on the game. All right, last game going into the break. Not exactly a barn burner, but we have the Rockets against the Clippers. Houston comes in on a back-to-back. They are terrible on back-to-backs, 1-6-1, second to last in the league. They are 7-1 to the over on back-to-backs, which is second best in the league. Porter and Wood are listed as out right now. That's definitely something to watch, as both of those have been important pieces across the season, but especially recently, they've been important. So here's some of the stuff that I'm looking at in this game. Man, these larger spreads are always so hard to cap. I see it's up to 10.5 now. What did I have on here? 11. Yeah, when I looked at it earlier, it was 9.5. Maybe I should have jumped on it there, but it's like Phoenix against Houston last night where the spread is minus 16.5, and you just think, holy shit, that's just too much. And even though Phoenix absolutely beats Houston by 17 points plenty of the time, and I almost feel the same way here. I mean, the Clippers are not the Suns. They've been playing decent lately, but man, 10.5 is a lot. But let's jump into some of the numbers and talk about why. Norman Powell is out for the Clippers, and we're going to talk about the difference that makes as well. Probably not a great thing for them, especially offensively. So Houston allows 124.3 points per game without Christian Wood this year. That's something worth paying attention to. The offensive numbers are pretty negligible, but one of the things I'm going to be interested in here is the total. And if Wood sits, you would think, oh, that's bad for the Rockets. They're going to have trouble scoring. But I think it's good for the Clippers because it makes the interior of Houston pretty weak. And so if Wood sits, that makes me like the under a lot less because they give up so many points when he's out. Kevin Porter Jr. makes no real statistical difference across the season. Yeah, I think they're better probably when he's in, but I'm not going to put too much emphasis on it. Here's another one, though, with Norm Powell out. The Clippers have scored 3 more a game. We're only talking about 3 games here. So, again, very small sample size. We got to take that with a grain of salt. but they're giving up 22 more points a game with him in than with him out. And it's only 3 games, but they've given up 137, 135, and 112 in 3 games with Norman Powell. So the fact that he's out, I actually think reduces them back to this core that they had to play with for a long time before the trade. And I think they might be a little more cohesive defensively. So again, Powell being out to me is a negative for the Clippers on offense, but I think it's a positive for them on defense, at least for the time being. The Clippers have played 12 of their last 15 away from home, and they're finally back home. It's a small sample size, but in those games at home, they did score 119, 113, and 111, and that was against Golden State, Milwaukee, and then the Lakers. So did score pretty decent. The Clippers against bad defenses in their last 15, right, 111 to 116 almost every game. There's one outlier at 139, but all the rest in that 111 to 116. So I think it's reasonable to expect the Clippers to be in that same range tonight, 111 to 116. I know that teams can put up massive numbers on the Rockets. And again, if Christian Wood sits, I might rethink that and consider whether they'd score more. But with Powell out, I don't think this is a high-powered offensive team. And I think against most other teams, I would put them under 110. So 111 to 116 is what I would look at there. And depending, I haven't looked yet, but depending what numbers we can get on the team total, if a number in that range gives us an edge, I would consider that. Houston has lost the back end of a back-to-back like every game this season. They're yet to win one outright. And so it's tough to bet on them. But when you look at the numbers they've lost by, only 2 of those games have been less than 10. So again, if you want to talk about the spread here, that is something that would lean toward the Clippers. 20 points, 13, 12, 13, 34, and 13. So looking for these channels or looking for things that are consistent. Houston has lost by 12 or 13 over 50% of the time on the back end of back-to-back, and we're right below that number right now. So maybe there's a little bit of value there. On the other hand, Houston does allow 121.3 points per game on 0 days of rest, 50.9% field goal percentage, 36.4 3-point percentage. So they do tend to give up a lot of points. And again, if you pair that, if Wood ends up being out, you pair those together, makes me more iffy on how many points they're going to give up tonight. In terms of the matchup issues here, there's not necessarily a ton. The only thing is that the Clippers are number 26 defending against points in the paint, and Houston is number 8 scoring with points in the paint. So that is a little bit of an advantage for Houston. I line this game at Clippers 115, Houston 103. So that gives a 12-point difference. The spread's at 11 or 10.5. You can understand why I wouldn't have too much interest in the spread here between these two teams. But I do have the total at 218, and right now it's at 228. So that's a big difference. The thing, again, that makes me hesitant is waiting to see, is Wood going to play or not? Does that make a 10-point difference? Yeah, maybe not. As I talk through this, that's maybe, I see maybe you can even get 228.5 somewhere. This is something I might have to move on. It's probably the only other play that I really like other than the Heat spread on this slate. So that is something that I definitely will consider. And if you like it, something you may want to consider as well. But again, I had a great week last week, was up a lot. I'm down, not quite as much as I was up last week, but it hasn't been a strong week for me. So totally understand if you want to fade the picks too. My hope is that you find some useful information in the breakdowns, whether you bet with me or against me. So hopefully that happens. Hey, this has been fun. I think we've been making some good progress with some of the guests that we've had. Always, if you have constructive feedback, I would be happy to hear it. You know where to find me on Twitter. It's right there on the screen. You can also email me actually at bigtastysports@gmail.com. If you have any thoughts or questions or anything, that's another way to reach out. As always, this does take a lot of work, and I'm not saying that to whine. I like doing the work, so that's not me saying, oh, poor me. Just saying it does take a lot of work, and so if it's something you benefit from, and you could go over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this and give a 5-star rating, drop a review, that would be super helpful. Appreciate there's a number of you who are always retweeting when the breakdown pops up. I appreciate that so much, truly. I'm grateful that you do it, grateful that you're listening, but those retweets and likes and stuff like that also tremendously help. So appreciate it. Thank you. We actually do have a couple special episodes coming up over the break. On Saturday, going to be back with Phil Nasons talking about the All-Star break some, and then actually getting into a little bit of his story. He has a really interesting history as a professional tennis coach and how he got into sports gambling and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to deviate from the breakdown path a little bit and talk to him some about his story. And then next week, I think I'm going to be able to pair up with one of the guys from Bet Crushers to look ahead to the baseball season. First, we'll talk about whether we're going to have one, and then talk a little bit of baseball. So if you are into baseball, that's something you might want to keep an eye out for. Hey, have a great last day of the NBA before the break, and I will see you guys on Twitter. Have a great day.